You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game, and we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening because we have as our guest Troy LaRaviere. Troy is president, would you say president of the Principals and Administrators Association.
That's right.
For CPS, or
right.
For Chicago Schools.
For Chicago
Public Schools.
Exactly.
Okay. And you've been in that position how long?
2 years now. It'll be 2 years on July 1.
And that's a paid position, right?
Yes.
And that's when you left CPS, right?
I left CPS about a month or two after I took this position.
Okay.
Yes.
And folks, if we're almost starting in the middle of the show, so if you missed part one, you'll want to go to youtube.com/publicaffairs.tv and then watch the show, or watch it and go back. So it's unusual that most of our shows, we've done 4 other candidates for mayor in the city of Chicago, and only one show. Troy's getting 2. Somebody's going to complain about that.
Because I'm long-winded.
Either that or the host was long-winded. Anyway, so about Troy, well, you'll find out more. You can go to troyforchicago.com. You'll find out if you go to the show, you'll get more of a background and history. But you've been at CPS as a teacher, assistant principal, until the last 2 years for what, about 2 decades?
Since 1997.
Okay. So we'll want to maybe we get somebody to close that door. I don't know. Anyway.
Should I go ahead and deal with it?
No, you're good. You're good. Okay. We'll just keep everybody at bay and quiet here. Okay.
So let her know.
Yeah. Maybe just see how it's cinema verite here. We're just casual. I mean, our guests do all sorts of things. They have to talk. They have to close doors. They are multitasking. And then seriously, well, this guy is a multitasker. So how long did you say you've been at CPS about?
I came in '97, so it's been 20 years since my first year, but I did take a 6-year break from CPS to go back and get a master's.
So about 12 years or so.
Right.
Okay. The main thing is he's got a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge about CPS. He also has an interesting story to tell people. You find out at the beginning of our show about his mother being white, his father being black, and what that meant in terms of where they lived and how he traversed all across the south side of Chicago. And where we left it last week, we were talking about, well, we should say we're taping the show on June 21st, and you'll probably see it a week or 2 later, so you'll see it in early July. And the story du jour in early June was about the CPS, well, I don't want to find out, yeah, I guess the CPS scandal. The scandal at CPS in terms of the apparently large number of complaints of sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct by staff at CPS, whether they were administrators, whether they were teachers, whether they were volunteers, and those were actions taken against students. Most of that was not disclosed, and for the last 10 years it's been about at least 20 credible complaints of that type of conduct per year, and since it's about 40 weeks to an academic year, it's about 1 every other week. And you were giving the explanation at the end of the last show. In your view, one of the major reasons, maybe the major reason, was the shortfall in credentialed staff at your 600-student school, which I guess you picked that because that's sort of an average size?
It's the average size in CPS is about 575.
Okay, so you could go ahead.
And so I was pointing out the overstaffing in the schools to point out the larger overstaffing in general. That finding, a lot of it was focused on central office, which is just as understaffed or maybe even more understaffed than the schools, because they began cutting in central office back in the days of Ron Huberman, when Daley was still mayor. And so,
well, they had a lot to cut.
So what I'm saying is that if the problem was background checks, so one of the problems, for example, was background checks.
Right, you mentioned
they
that.
were not detailed enough. They did background checks on everyone who came into the district, but they were not detailed enough in the sense that if a background check came up with an offense that was not an offense that was deemed one so egregious that you couldn't be hired, they let you in. And so if it had nothing to do with, if your offense had nothing to do with a danger, proposing a danger to students, they let you in. But some of these offenses they found were lessened from a charge that was greater. So there was one instance, for example, where a staff member had an offense. They deemed it to be okay to hire him, but when they looked into it, they saw that he basically pleaded down to a lesser offense from one that would have gotten him banned. But in order to do that kind of detailed background check, you can't just have a computer thing. You have to have real people going into every single one and looking into the details behind where this charge came from. Was it downgraded from something else? That's what the Tribune was recommending. You need staff to do that. A lot more than you have doing that right now. And that's just in background checks. We haven't talked about staffing for oversight, staffing for notification about the districts, which was also a problem, or staffing to track this behavior across the school district.
But in one case, Gerald Gaddy, you know about Gerald Gaddy? He's the guy with 4 felony
Simeon,
convictions.
right?
Simeon.
Yeah.
4 felony convictions for possessing or dealing drugs. And the district warned Simeon not to let him in the school. So there's a case in which apparently the background check was sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
The central district picked it up. They told the Simeon, the school. I don't know who they tell. Maybe you tell me. Does that notification go to the principal? Because who dropped the ball there? Because you would know. You're head of the Principals and Administrators Association at CPS, right? So you would know.
So I've never gotten a background check that said don't hire this person. I've gotten stuff back. I don't know where the ball was dropped at Simeon. Wherever it was dropped, you have to figure out where, who dropped it, and most of all, what caused the drop. Was this just a person who was derelict in their duty, or was there something wrong in the process? And depending on how the ball was dropped, then that determines what needs to be done. You know, maybe it's just punishing someone who dropped the ball or someone who was neglectful of their duties. Because they got a letter that said, do not, almost under no circumstances should this person be working at your school.
Right, this was unambiguous.
Right.
Don't let him in the school.
Not.
But the school, according to the Tribune, ignored that, and he assaulted 40. Count them 40 times. And if you had a guess, and maybe somebody will be on trial here, but until we know more, if you had a guess and you know what emphasis is placed on athletics, and this guy was viewed, you said because if they had more staff, no, he was viewed as a great coach. He was viewed as a guy who could help Simeon be more of the sports super school than they were.
Don't misunderstand what I'm saying.
That's how it sounds to me.
Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here.
Somebody in their school wanted to see this be a sports powerhouse, and they said, okay, so he has 4 felony convictions, so they're telling us not to hire him. We're going to do it. I mean, the point is, here's my point, and then you can respond. Somebody is guilty of gross malfeasance here. Is it Forrest Claypool, who is the CEO? Is it Janice Jackson, who is the chief academic officer? Is it the network chief? Is it Rahm Emanuel, who handpicked Forrest Claypool to be there? Mm-hmm. And he's paid $250,000 plus, okay? I mean, really, it's not a simple job, but we expect a lot. So far, 6 months after the CPS must have known this, because that's when Tribune first filed the FOIA report, nothing. I mean, yesterday in the Chicago Tribune, legislators blast CPS over sex abuse. This is the Chicago Tribune, June 21, okay? And reported last night, the new president, Janice Jackson, former chief academic officer, she wasn't there. There was a chair for her there. Frank Clark, the president of the Chicago School Board, he wasn't there. I ask you, Mr. Clark, come on the show and tell us why you weren't there, what was more important. Come on, Mrs. Jackson, and you tell us, because I haven't been able to get you on the show. And I've been trying for years, okay? Because Mr. Clark's been around there. So it's not personal, but do you notice a certain indignancy in my voice?
Yeah, I might detect just a little bit.
Do you agree with that? Should you be as indignant as I am?
Of course.
Are you as indignant as I am?
Of course I am.
'Cause you're
Well, I
running
mean,
for
I
mayor.
can't get into your head,
Okay.
but I would imagine that we're both pretty indignant.
All right, now I talked. You give us your full shot here.
So one, I don't want you to misunderstand my original point. I don't think understaffing is the sole cause. It's just that the causes, that the things that you mentioned, I've heard from dozens of people. And the one thing I haven't heard is the understaffing piece. And so I see it as part of my role to bring into the public debate the thing that I'm not hearing. I agree with everything else I'm hearing, in addition to what, including what you've just said. But I see it as part of my role to remind people about the role that staffing plays in this. You can have all the staffing in the world, but if you don't have the right policies, the right emphasis, and the right leadership, it's not going to matter. You can have the right leadership and the right policies, and if you don't have the staffing to implement it, it's not going to matter either. So I think you have to have both. And in terms of looking at the ones, we came to this point from looking at the Simeon example. The Simeon example actually clouds the picture because it's a school-based example. What the problem there, it looks like central office did their job, and it looks like the ball was dropped at the school level. We don't know how it was dropped, if someone ignored it. You mentioned that it looks like maybe they ignored it on purpose because this guy was a coach and they were an athletic powerhouse. And the point I made the last time was that they had to rely on this person because CPS refused to fund their athletic program. They couldn't hire a coach. And if they could have hired a coach, you can't get in CPS through the normal hiring process without a background check. He was able to get through without a background check because he was a volunteer, and typically they let them volunteer while the background check is happening. In a staffing situation, that's impossible. You can't step foot into a classroom until that background check is completed.
But he did.
But he wasn't a staff, he was a volunteer.
Okay, so
You know
you're
what I'm
saying
saying?
it's easier for a volunteer to get into the classroom.
Right, and that's what they have
than
to
with
fix
students. Okay.
Right,
I see your
exactly,
point.
that's the point.
But one other point here is, you know what the budget is roughly for CPS currently?
Almost
Total?
$6 billion.
$6 billion. It's been pretty much that for a few years, a little higher, a little lower. You know how many students roughly there are in CPS?
I want to say a little less than 300,000.
I think it's more like 400,000. So
more
take
than
my
300,000.
number, because it makes my argument even stronger. Let's assume it's 400,000. You do quick math, 400,000 into $6 billion, you come up with $15,000 per kid per year. That's our average expenditure, counting everything, all costs, in CPS. $15,000 per kid per year. I mean, the folks out there, because the other article on page 1 today in the Chicago Tribune, and you can talk about this too as a candidate for mayor, is the $110 average increase in property taxes. So the CPS budget is $6 billion. A lot of that is funded by property taxes. Some comes from the state, some comes from the feds, some comes from the local taxpayers here in Chicago. And they got an $8 billion budget for everything, maybe closer to 9 now, 8 or 9 billion, who's counting, for everything other than CPS. So you're talking CPS, if you bring the schools into that, $15 billion. It's not a small excuse me, if you're talking the city of Chicago, because you're running for mayor, Troy LaRaviere is running for mayor, you're talking about the Chicago budget exclusive of CPS being about $9 billion. You're talking about CPS budget being $6 billion. That's about $15 billion under your purview as mayor. It's been under Rom's purview. You elected UB. And so, short question, and one other stat, and then your turn. My understanding, the median salary at CPS used to be about $67,000. It's climbed over $70,000. I don't know the exact number. You don't know either, but it's probably $75,000 a year. So, assuming those things are not
72.
Okay, we'll take that. $72,000 a year median salary. Half the people at CPS who are teaching, I think this is just for teachers, not administrators. Half the teachers are getting more than $72,000, half less, median $72,000. $15,000 per kid per year. Should that be enough? How you can count certified staff and this staff and that. Should $15,000 per year median salary, $72,000 for teachers. Should that be enough to give people a quality product that doesn't end up with numerous rapes and assaults?
So I have two answers, a two-part answer to that question. Number one, 72,000 on a family of 4 would put you maybe 10, 15,000 above the mark where you would qualify for benefits, reduced lunch benefits in school. 72,000 is not, wealthy. The second thing is that there are districts close to us where the average or the median income for a teacher is over 100,000. As a matter of fact, there are 52 districts within a 15 to 45-minute drive that teachers can go to, or administrators can go to, where they actually pay principals more than they pay them right here. And I imagine if they're paying principals more, that most of them are probably paying their teachers more. 52 districts just in the Cook County area within a 45-minute drive of Chicago, 15 to 45 minutes. And the second part of your question, or the second part of my answer is, it should be. I would think if it's not enough, it should be close to enough. But we have to look at how the money is being spent. Because Chicago Public Schools is the most understaffed school district in the state of Illinois. We are ranked 857 out of 858. As a matter of fact, just today, PolitiFact and the Better Government Association fact-checked. They've heard me say that. We are the most understaffed school district in the state of Illinois. And so they fact-checked it over the past month. And today came with their finding that it is true that we are virtually the most understaffed school district in the state. But that $15,000 per student is $2,000 above the state average. So how can you be the most understaffed school district when you're not the most underfunded, when you don't spend the least, anywhere near the least per pupil? And the answer to that is corruption. When you have a district that is hell-bent on sending our tax dollars, whether they be city tax dollars or school district tax dollars, to the banks that donate to the mayor's campaign in the form of $1.2 billion in interest payments for bad loans, to Aramark and Sodexo custodial management companies, hundreds of millions of dollars to these two companies that are Emmanuel campaign donors that have left our schools filthy, to Northern Trust, the Pritzker Foundation, and Goldman Sachs, giving them $34 million of our tax dollars for loaning us $17 million, doubling their profits, right? And the reason they said they were giving them double was it was for a pre-K program. And they said that they're giving them double because the kids in pre-K outlearn the kids who did not get pre-K. Well, that's what's supposed to happen when you get pre-K. Right? If you ask your plumber to do an assessment of your house, and he says this is going to be about $10,000 to fix this, are you going to tell him, well, I'll give you $20,000 if the pipes don't leak? Like, who pays double for something doing what it's supposed to do? Our mayor will pay double our tax dollars to his campaign donors, right? But anyone who is a responsible manager of public funds would not engage in that kind of thing. I could go on and on, but the point is that $15,000 per pupil you mentioned ends up not being enough because we're paying for the cost of corruption, of electing corrupt leaders to run our city and run our school district for the past 2 decades, and that has to end.
Yeah. Have you ever talked to Mayor Rahm Emanuel about that?
I've talked to Rahm, I think 3 times. Short conversations when I was a principal, when he was giving me awards, which he'd like to forget. I was the one of only 4 principals in the district to win the mayor's Principal Merit Award for 3 consecutive years. And I remember the second time I won it, I asked him about spending TIF dollars. I had not come out against his policies at that point. I asked him about spending TIF dollars on the district, and he gave me some talking point. I don't even remember what it was, but basically he was saying no, he wasn't going to do it. And that was the last time I actually had a conversation with him, if you can call that a conversation.
Well, it'd be good. So, Rahm Emanuel, Mayor, we're inviting you publicly to be on this show. We'll have you come on just as Troy is, individually. But then we don't have to have a full debate of all 10 candidates. We can have some casual conversations. Wouldn't you like to address what Roy just said? I'm sure, what Troy just said? Wouldn't you? You'd like to have a little casual conversation with the mayor about this, right?
Sure.
I mean, seriously, this is what makes the country better, when we have people who are running for office engaging in respectable, civil discussions, and then people make decisions on who's going to be best to run the city, right?
Right. That's not what he engages in. He likes to stage everything he can stage. He doesn't have open meetings. He doesn't have open press briefings. Everything has to be staged so that the public sees everything he wants them to see, and they don't see anything or hear anything he doesn't want them to hear.
Okay.
So he would not do that.
Well, we mentioned, let's shift topics here over to finance, because you've raised some corruption issues, and that's certainly, and some financial issues that relate to corruption. But overall, what is your approach? If you were to give people a view, how do you approach finance issues? How familiar are you with the city budget? How familiar are you with the CPS budget? How familiar are you with property taxes and the alternative ways to make revenue? Let me let you just talk for a minute or two. Give people a sense of how you approach financial issues for the city of Chicago.
So I think one of the most important, there are 4 important characteristics you want to see in a mayor. And the one I mentioned first is being a responsible manager of public money. You know, I handled tens of millions of dollars as principal of Blaine Elementary School. Never a dime lost to corruption, pay to play. Never left taxpayers in debt or ran a deficit. And always spent the money on things that were evidence-based, proven to work. And so in terms of managing a city budget, it would be the same philosophy, that we have to target our dollars on things that have an evidence base behind them. For example, if we're talking about economic development, it has been shown that investment in small business, not huge companies, but actually having a high ratio of businesses to residents, right, or residents to businesses, that's what creates strong economies. And so with the limited tax dollars you have to invest in the thing that's been shown to create the most resilient and strongest economies. And so I would invest that money in fostering and encouraging and incubating small business. But I would use that evidence-based approach in every aspect of government. That's how we made Blaine Elementary School the #1 neighborhood, the #1 neighborhood school in Chicago. It wasn't #1 when we got there. It was a great school. It was in the top 10. But we used evidence. We spent those dollars on evidence-based practices that have been shown to increase student achievement. And you have those kinds of practices in every area of government. Now, in terms of where money comes from, I think that might be where you're angling here. Is it?
Not so much, and stick where you are right
Sure.
on that issue. What do you know about economic development? Because some people say all the effort goes into the shiny city by Rom and not into the neighborhoods on the south side, west side, and then more on the north side. What do you know about evening that out? Does the economic development not occur on the south and west sides because businesses are afraid to go out there? Because the crime rate is higher, the risk is higher, or are there other reasons? And what do you do as mayor, whatever the reason is, to get more growth in business in the south and west side, and to get more job opportunities in the south and west side? What do you do as mayor on those 2 issues?
And so I've already addressed the first part of that in terms of economic development, the thing that creates strong, robust economies that are resilient in the face of these national downturns in the economy is a high ratio of small businesses to residents. Right? And so that means
Small businesses.
Small businesses.
And what do you do to get those small businesses? Are they here in Illinois, but they're not being nurtured, or they're not? Or you have to attract them to Illinois more than we have?
And so that's another problem with this particular mayor. The theme is that we have to bring in outsiders. Right? We have what we need right here in Chicago. We have the entrepreneurial spirit right here in this city. We're not investing in people who want to start a business, who are not either not being invested in or have to jump through the red tape and the hoops that City Hall makes them jump through. We have to tear down those hoops, get that red tape out of the way, get rid of the disincentives to start a small business on one end, and then incubate, support, and invest in it on the other end. Does that answer your question?
Okay, let me just shift over. We're moving along here. We only got about 4 or 5 minutes left, so
Sure.
I'm conscious of the clock. You've heard about the pension issue, whether it's statewide, whether it's citywide. You may have heard wirepoints.com looked at 200 cities and villages across the state. In 2016, all of those cities and villages were underfunding their fire and police pensions. City of Chicago has a major pension problem there. Rom says he's reformed it. They're still quite underfunded, and if the alternative is to fund them by raising taxes even more, the people at WirePoints, Ted Dabrowski, says you can't raise taxes enough to do it. He says you got to start thinking about restructuring among creditors, maybe even having the state of Illinois give the city of Chicago and other villages what other states, maybe half across the country, have given their cities and villages the right to file for bankruptcy, which would say to all your creditors, you're gonna have to take a haircut. And so some of the pension people would have to take a haircut, despite what the Illinois state constitution says. Some of the other bondholders would have to take a haircut. Creditors across the board. That's the idea. What do you say to that?
Well, Ted Dabrowski, the man you're quoting here,
Yeah.
is part of the Illinois Policy Institute.
Not anymore. Now he's the head of WirePoints. But you're right. He
A
was
right-wing think tank.
Well, it's a think tank. It's conservative. BGA is kind of a liberal group.
It's a right-wing think tank.
It's a right wing. Okay.
And so he's a spin master. In relationship to funding our pensions, we have to remember how we got here, right? If you have a husband who spends, if a woman has a husband who spends the mortgage money on his toys or on his friends or on some extravagant thing for over a year, and now you're a year behind in the mortgage, right? You might think you have a mortgage crisis, and it would be reasonable to think you have a mortgage crisis, but you don't, right? You have a husband crisis. That's what you have. You have a crisis in the leadership of your family, right? We got into this pension crisis not because the pensions were too expensive, but because we have politicians who took that money and wasted it on other priorities. Priorities that were not essential to the functioning of government.
So the argument is, and you framed it, and we're only got a minute left,
Sure.
but if Ted were here, and he's been on this show, so I think I know what he would say, he would cite the stat, which BGA should look into, that incomes across Illinois have over the last 30 years gone up about 100%, but pension benefits have gone up about 1,000%, tenfold. So his point, we didn't underfund because people haven't been willing to pay their taxes, their obligations. We raised pension benefits too much faster than income in general. You got, like, I'm sorry to do this, about 30 seconds to answer, and then we're going to have to get you back for a third time.
Well, when CPS consulted with an outside firm to do a financial analysis, they showed that pension benefits projected out were going to rise something like 34%, while
Projected out
debt
over what-
yes,
over what
over
period?
about 10 years.
Okay.
While debt service to banks that are the mayor's campaign contributors was going to rise 350%. And you don't hear Mr. Dabrowski saying much about
Well,
the
help
debt we
Mr.
owe to
Dabrowski.
them.
Do you have a site so he can know where to look to find that study that you pointed to?
Ernst & Young was the auditor that did the study.
We'll get it to
And
him after.
the CPS's own site is.
I just want to remind everybody, we're cutting this short because you got to remind you to come back next week and every week, see Public Affairs. But I see Berkowitz. He's nothing to treat people like Troy LaRaviere, who's one of the 10 candidates running for mayor, and he's done it twice. That's a heavy duty. Thank you so much, Troy.
Thank you.
Troy LaRaviere running for mayor of the city of Chicago.